Hi everybody, this is Tom Pfennig, CEO of Transforming Legal. I am highly excited to announce that Matt Galvin is going to join our company. Matt has been the former Chief Compliance Officer of AB InBev and moved to the Department of Justice, as we in this compliance community worldwide noticed. And I'm thrilled, Matt, to have you on board. And this interview is going to introduce you to our clients, to the global legal and compliance community. And with that, over to you. If you could briefly introduce yourself, and then we have a few questions to help people understand what capacity and caliber you're bringing to Transforming Legal.
Thanks, Tom. Absolutely thrilled to be on the podcast, and even more thrilled to be part of the Transforming Legal team. I've spent the last almost 3 years as the first ever counsel for compliance and data analytics at the fraud section of the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. So I'm looking forward to a job with fewer prepositions in the title. But it was a tremendous opportunity to be a public servant. I worked a lot on evaluating corporate compliance programs, on setting the policy to evaluate programs, on the selection and operation of compliance monitors, voluntary reporting. And I also had the opportunity to work with the amazing fraud section team to build out data analytics to both identify instances of white-collar crime and assist in the investigation of white-collar crime. It's been, the opportunity of a lifetime. I will forever be grateful to the chance to serve, but I'm extremely excited for my next move.
Awesome. Hey, I recall 3 years ago when your move was announced and you received the call from DOJ that I wasn't surprised, to be frank with you. You have been and are one of the most front-running compliance officers in the world, instituted a data-driven compliance framework within AB InBev, and obviously leverage that data affinity and expertise in your current role, and will obviously leverage it also here at Transforming Legal. Now 3 years at DOJ, moving out, why are you leaving?
When I came to DOJ, it was always with an understanding that it was going to be a tour of duty of about 2 to 3 years. So really, this is a schedule. I was called in and recruited to come. A good friend of mine had a very senior position in the prior administration. They're like, Matt, we want to build out our capability to investigate, kind of identify. We have to, we're leaving a lot of money on the table in terms of what we can look at. Amazing data sources. We've had some historical success, but we need to do a lot more. And the second was, you obviously know a lot about compliance. I had been doing trainings for the department for years prior to actually joining. And so I knew a lot of the line attorneys and a lot of the chiefs. I had a good working relationship with them coming in. And so getting someone who had that experience in-house to really look between the lines in terms of when the government's making an evaluation of whether a compliance program is working or not, having someone that had been there, I think was good for the department. And I hope it was good for the compliance community too, because I think the last 10 years or so has seen extreme advances in the field of compliance. And when you think about where the kind of field was, it was like almost for people that wanted to do in-house legal but couldn't. And now it's really where the excitement is. You have all the technology and behavioral science in trying to integrate how to make corporations work better. To me, it's a really exciting time to be in the space of compliance.
Totally agree. And I think it's reflected in the evolution of the department as well, also given the memos on the effectiveness of corporate compliance frameworks, that the data part has become more and more important. The analytics part has become more and more important. And I think this is certainly an achievement that you can attribute to yourself as well.
A lot of times when I talk to folks and they're like, how can we possibly put the technology in? I mean, some of this adoption happens without people seeing. It's like, can you imagine working a compliance program without email? Do you think compliance programs always had email? Somehow that adoption happened, and it probably wasn't driven by compliance. It created a lot of compliance issues, but the idea of operating a program without these kind of basics of technology is unfathomable. And I think the same is going to be true with generative AI. I think it's, we're at a tipping point where corporations are adopting it, and there's a strategy of getting the kind of consumers to adopt it ahead of enterprises. And so you have almost a disconnect in some organizations of where the company is and where the population is. And that's not the first time in history that's happened. If you look at like word processing in the 90s, enterprises had Lotus Notes And Microsoft made Word available so that consumers got addicted and got like, wow, this is amazing. And the enterprises had to move to catch up. And it's not that dissimilar from like cloud computing, 10, 15 years ago. It was becoming available and the enterprises had to move to catch up. And when it happens, that shift can be really dramatic. And I think we're in a similar dramatic shift with different species of AI at the moment.
Yes, and I think what we offer in our particular combination is, despite the drama that might be a part of this change, to also offer some comfort and some confidence. You and I have been working together as heads of compliance in multinational organizations at a point where data and processes and mass data analytics were really not as established as now. So we have been in this journey for quite some time and we have been benefiting from these improvements. And this brings me to the question, what's your motivation to join Transforming.Legal and the mission that we obviously would like to join together going forward?
Yeah, I agree with you in terms of the opportunity. I also agree with you, when I look back on my legal career, I think we almost became lawyers at one of the worst times to become a lawyer in the history of law. Data was exploding, that email transition had happened. But the second line of defense and the law firms were really grappling with what to do. What they saw as just a huge data problem of how do you really, in today's words, create signal from huge amounts of data. Then it was like, how do you get a lot of people to process data through very human, inefficient ways? And so I think growing up as a lawyer in that kind of period of like friction between the technology and the kind of ways to manage it, it gave me a lot of pause. And when I ran a compliance program, I never wanted anyone to have the experience that I did as a lawyer, because I think being a lawyer, commanding information, getting data, getting insight, advising your client to the best impact, that's exciting stuff, right? To do it without fact is kind of terrifying and kept me up at night. And so I both thought we can be effective, and I think lawyers can love their job again by getting more comfortable with technologies that help them sort through huge amounts of information, help them get it reliably, help them get it in a way that they can take insight and take that insight to either improve their compliance program, advise their clients better, manage risk better, just accomplish the mission better. And I think the way you and I think are very much in sync on this kind of, managing the risk of technology, but using technology to manage risk. But all in all, keeping an eye on the person and not just thinking of like the corporation as like data and cogs and parts, but a corporation is like people struggling to do their best, to manage risk, to make the right decision, to help the company thrive. And I think that's, to me, a core part of the Transforming Legal mission. It's empowerment with technology and data.
Fantastic. And at the same time, really ensuring that an organization is not getting into trouble. Expectations of the regulators, particularly in the United States, the UK, Germany, wherever, are being met. So you're really serving a lot of objectives with one or two adjustments in terms of tech, in terms of data, and of course also in terms of the human aspect. So there is so many win-wins in this equation that I think the mission is clear. There is anxiety out there for sure, and we have been in those transformations. Not everything is predictable and there is certainly disruption. However, you are not ethical, as I always say, if you keep burning human capital, if you're not identifying these transactional recurring activities and move them into standardization, automation, freeing up your brain power to really become business partners, to become risk managers, to become strategic advisors. And I think that's the mission of Transforming.Legal with calibers like you being on board.
And I really like that. And when I look at this from a U.S. perspective, and whether it's the justice or kind of organizations that have more regulatory bodies, and what I would be thinking about if I was still in that CISO role, now is actually an amazing time of opportunity. Because the chances of you having to justify your program to someone like me for the next 3 years aren't super high. But it doesn't mean you don't want to be ethical, and it doesn't mean you want to throw out the compliance programs. It doesn't mean you don't have a spider web of contractual or other regulatory reasons to do the right thing. But you can sit back and say, is that compliance process, that I'm doing and creating a lot of documentation that takes a lot of time, is that really the most efficient way to do it? Looking at this environment, say, is there a way that I can capture technology, or is there a way that I can optimize process or do an RPA, robotic process automation, or having some sort of AI system do this. Now's a great time for experimentation. I can, cancel your contracts, go to some pause, redo everything. Now's an awesome time to do that. And I think it's a way to reposition yourself. When I think of talking to my network, my peers, the people I used to work with, what's next in their career, you're going to create your career by being super efficient, providing advice, and understanding what matters to your company. And by being nimble, understanding and driving transparency, getting access to information, that's going to make you indispensable. Now, that's not how compliance always operated. And now's a good time to kind of pivot to a compliance strategy or a legal strategy that's going to be good for the business and better for you professionally.
Absolutely. And I would say it's not experimenting anymore, because some like you and us have been in these stages and have proven that improvement is sustainable and viable. So we also enable those people who are exactly looking at what you have just described to boldly embrace the opportunity and not think that there is a risk that cannot be managed. It's really upside potential in many respects. So going to the biggest catalyst for change and innovation as our second last question here, I think what you've just said resonates with a lot of folks that are challenged to do more with less, and budgets are shrinking. There is an expectation that compliance takes over AI governance, data privacy, of course, ESG in some cases. Companies are changing their business and commercial models. There's much more digitalization, IP. So a lot that is thrown at compliance officers these days. And I think that is a catalyst at one point, because you have to cope with these challenges with the volume of your portfolio, and you need innovation to be successful in this respect. Would you agree, these being catalysts for innovation and change?
At the same time, what's not? If your main arrow in your quiver was the fear of me coming down with a team of FBI agents, I think you need to question your management, your ethos, and the value proposition that compliance is bringing. That's always going to be part of it. And I don't think the fear has necessarily gone away. The statute of limitations is what it is. The things will happen. If you're a public company, you're still going to need to account for spend. If you're operating in data, you still need to think of your privacy and your cybersecurity. Clearly, when you look at the US, export controls, sanctions, any sort of government contracting, there's still things to comply with that organizations need to think about. But at the same time, I think there is room for efficiency. I think there's huge opportunity to use technologically to be more efficient. I think there's a lot of things that we can rethink entirely as to why we did them in that way. There's a lot of maybe, licenses that we bought that now are just kind of basically obsolete by what's free through your AWS cloud or Azure cloud subscription. Good analogy is I used to have a pocket flashlight. How many people have pocket flashlights anymore? The iPhone flashlight kind of took that away. There's really not much need for it. Similarly, there's a lot of little software packages that we've bought or subscriptions that we have as programs. Your training modules or training packages that we paid huge amounts of money, the humans translating, things that AI can quickly package and do for us in ways that are just going to make much more efficient. And you can show those wins to management, right? I've always thought something like, compliance training, it's incredibly important to your compliance. If you have a chance to reach, at AB InBev was 180,000 people, and I would target 50 to 80,000 of them. And why go with some kind of clunky thing that the lawyers love? That's not who really my audience is. And they're certainly not your audience in the next 3 years. Your audience can entirely be your 80,000 people. Focus on driving them. And I guarantee you, or I'm pretty certain, that when it comes around again and someone wants to look at, the question's not going to be, did the lawyers love your training 2 years ago? The question's going to be, how did your training influence behavior, and how did you measure that behavior? And how did you show ROI for your compliance activities? These are the questions that are going to keep coming up for stakeholders as the field advances, as people in my seat kind of continue to think about effectiveness rather than performance and documentation. And as we think about our compliance program, that's what's going to make it exciting. And that's what's going to bring better people into your compliance program, right? The chance to move people to make better decisions.
And I like the excitement. I feel the passion that you bring to the table. I'm equally passionate. That's why the two of us fit together so well. And I think that's a part of being a compliance officer, being really a guardian of integrity, a guardian of commercial success at the same time, and still having a legal governance function on you, a combination that I feel is extremely interesting. Going back to the catalyst for change and innovation and the technology and the expectations of governments. Obviously, there have changes recently also in certain enforcement policies in the United States, and I think it would be negligent to not be aware of that. At the same time, it would be negligent to throw everything overboard. So can you comment on that perhaps? My point of view is that no matter what change there is laws still in place, statutes of limitations still in place, there's reputation and there's customer expectation at stake. So you have your own compass of values and credibility to follow regardless of whatever enforcement regime is out there. Given that I interview you in Washington, D.C., and you have been part of that environment for 3 years, can you give us some insights, some expectations also from your end?
It's a challenging moment. There's still only an acting head of the criminal division. There's only an acting head of fraud. There's a lot of uncertainty around U.S. government enforcement. Now, uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean there's not going to be prosecutions. It means what it means. It means it's uncertain. One of the lenses I kind of take and kind of look is historical. I came as a lawyer shortly after the dot-com boom, where it was go, 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 list, go, go, go. And what did you have? You had these massive corporate scandals of Enron and WorldCom that shaped a lot of regulation after. Now, the period of kind of the pendulum didn't swing back long, because then you had all the CDOs and the housing and the boom, like a booming New York financial market that went around the world, which was what happened. Huge economic switchback, from the housing crisis that reverberated around the globe. What's been kind of amazing to me over the last 15 years, it's not that there's a kind of switchback against compliance and enforcement now. It's that it's taken 15 years since the seismic crisis for this kind of to happen. Now, I think anytime you're in kind of a period of history, you have the sense that it's going to be there forever. But what I don't think is that the idea of regulation is going to be gone. The lessons of like 1934 and the Securities Act of 90 years ago aren't still relevant to us today, and the lessons post Enron aren't relevant to us today. And so if I was talking to a board, I would say what you'll first see, probably before you see a lot of regulatory action from US authorities, you'll see civil action, you'll see bankruptcy. You'll see companies that decided to go too aggressive and start cooking the books or being very aggressive for whatever reason, whether it's through a financial instrument or through channel stuffing or through kind of non-digital non-compliance or some sort of surveillance capitalism manipulation. Whatever flavor of risk hits your company, that might drive you or someone in your industry to the brink. And you don't want to be the one that goes first, because then there'll be a reverberation out. And if you're managing those risks, you're the one that can be nimble, be fast, be thoughtful, but you can kind of sail through that risk a lot better.
If I just could jump in quickly to a pressing challenge in our profession right now. AI governance is a little bit like GDPR governance 6 years ago. Fairness, bias, all these data security issues, you need to be on the watch as a compliance officer to not step into some potholes here, and then there will be enforcement for sure. So maybe we can shift in the last 5 minutes of our intro video here towards that. And I was intrigued when I was in New York about a year ago, and you were on a big panel downtown talking not just about the opportunities AI brings, and we are all excited about that, but also the risks. And I think the risk assessment part for the AI deployment is at its infancy. We at Transforming.Legal have an e-learning platform, as you know, BrainUp.Legal, which is an avatar-based academy where you are also covering that very subject in terms of AI governance and AI risk assessment. So maybe a few words from your perspective, what is to be expected from a compliance officer in the next few years when it comes to the large-scale deployment of AI at basically any company, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating the kind of forces at play and the geopolitical forces. When you take a step back from it, you have kind of like the US model, the China model, and the European model. The China model, where you have kind of a set of laws and rules where you're consolidating data from a few different players and you're accelerating these like really huge advances in AI. Whereas the US is much more diffuse venture capital, very low regulation, but generating even better results kind of right now. You're still kind of on a sugar rush of money that hopefully will be sustained. Europe is much more thoughtful and cautious. Less, you don't have the kind of free speech kind of paradigm in the US. You also don't have the strength of the tech forces kind of to drive. And so there's a lot more kind of thoughtful regulation, right? And a lot of that's normal, right? That's normal US-EU dynamic where the US is race ahead and we'll send the ambulances after you crash. And Europeans like, do we need to crash? Can we avoid the crashing? And so I think, depending on where you're doing business and how you want to develop, you have to think of which one of these models matters the most. Now, which for sure in the US right now, IP is almost taking a proxy for ethics. Like derivative use of things is kind of taken like a version of compliance on its own. And a lot of the more interesting discussions around managing AI are there. The other piece, when I was working on kind of guidance documents that the Department of Justice put out 6 months ago, is really to ensure accountability in our organization. And I thought of it with a lot of empathy from CCOs that someone needs to own this risk. And while we're not going to live in a world of transparency, there's certainly a need for metrics and mechanisms to understand how large language models work, how they're designing, what is going to be the limits in terms of their boundaries. And I think you're going to see in this next generation of things, it's going to become more important because right now, when you're typically interacting with an AI, you know it. And so there's like a human kind of reaction that like, so if you had an AI give you romantic advice, you'd be like, why would I take romantic advice from a robot? You might be more comfortable with like financial advice or something that. As the AIs get better to simulate kind of human empathy and human communication, the need for risk management, I think, is going to go up. Because right now there's a lot of kind of human buffer because you're working with a robot and there's kind of a human instinctive reaction from just a mass behavioral science. As that goes, it's going to create even a new challenge. Simultaneously with that is as these AI engines get more and more complex and the data going into them gets more and more diffuse, you're even going to see models increasingly trained off synthetic data. So like robots creating data to train robots while it seems more human. So it's like you have this opposing forces of the system seeming more empathetic and anthropic, whereas the data is actually becoming more and more removed from anything a human generated. It's going to create a fascinating set of risks, and it has to be, from an organizational perspective, whose job is it? And I'm not sure if this, there's a Portuguese expression, right? A dog with two owners starves to death. So like you might say it's like me and the security officer. Well, they might be very concerned about corporate data leaving, but they might be less concerned with what humans are doing with the data as processed by an AI. And there's a job there. And from an organizational standpoint, there has to be an empowered human being at the helm kind of thinking about these risks.
And I think this becomes even more prominent when you move to agentic AI, because then you're really simulating human workflows and approval processes in a digital world, and you are substituting that human buffer that you've just set. You need to really also make sure that when you move to these agentic supporters, that you have them under control, and that at the end of the day, you're not generating risk. At the same time, you are trying to leverage efficiencies. I always wanted to have podcasts or webinars where practitioners talk. I hope that we have been meeting that expectation of our audience, two practitioners talking to each other. I think you're joining an organization that is globally present. Transforming.legal has obviously footprints in the US, in Germany, in Singapore, in Brazil. We are also venturing into China and the Middle East. So we are an integrated, humble, nimble digital transformation boutique with a lot of tech expertise, with a lot of transformational expertise, obviously legal expertise as well. And you said it also, the human part is important. I think you and I have been leading large teams and organizations. So this change is disruptive. This change can be uncomfortable. This change needs to be managed culturally. And I'm, as I said before, excited having someone like you who has been in the trenches on both sides, corporates as well as government, complementing the service offerings of Transforming.legal. So with that, greetings to Washington, D.C. Matt, all the best for your transition out of DOJ into Transforming.legal. And I am thrilled to working with you, serving our clients in the United States and all over the world with your expertise and your personality. And thank you for taking the time while obviously there is change in your private life as well, sharing some insights, sharing motivations, and all the best. See you soon under the Transforming.legal brand. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Looking forward to it.
Bye.